Before dawn, the convent bell did not ring. It had always rung, even in winter, even when the sisters were sick, even when the town outside trembled with rumors of war. That morning, the bell was silent, and the silence itself felt like a warning. By the time the iron-shod boots reached the outer gate, the nuns already understood that whatever awaited them would not be brief and would not be merciful. Death, they would soon learn, was not the worst fate available to them. This story is not about the Ottoman Empire as a whole, nor about a single faith set against another. It is about moments when power collapsed into cruelty, when laws failed, and when women who had chosen lives of seclusion became targets precisely because they were defenseless. What happened to Christian nuns in certain borderlands and wartime episodes of the Ottoman world was not uniform, and it was not constant. But in specific times and places, their suffering followed a pattern so deliberate, so erasing, that many contemporaries described it as worse than death. To understand why, one must first understand who these women were. In the Balkans, Anatolia, the Levant, and the Eastern Mediterranean, Christian convents existed long before Ottoman expansion. They were often small, poor, and isolated. A convent might hold a dozen women, sometimes fewer. These women were not soldiers. They held no land in their own names. Many were widows or daughters placed there to avoid forced marriages or poverty. Their vows separated them from the world. They cut their hair, abandoned family names, and lived under strict discipline. Their safety depended on custom, reputation, and the belief that even conquerors would respect holy boundaries. That belief was not always honored. As the Ottoman state expanded between the 14th and 17th centuries, war became a constant presence in frontier regions. Villages changed hands, armies moved quickly, lived off the land, and rewarded loyalty with spoils. In theory, Ottoman law contained protections for people of the book, including Christians. In practice, during sieges, rebellions, or punitive campaigns, discipline broke down. Convents, which held no men and no weapons, were easy targets. The first horror was intrusion. Soldiers entered spaces that had been sealed from male presence for decades. Cloisters were breached, cells were opened. For nuns whose entire identity was built on separation from the world, this alone was a spiritual annihilation. Contemporary Christian chroniclers emphasize this violation again and again, not as metaphor, but as a literal destruction of meaning. A nun's life was defined by enclosure. Once that was broken, her former life could not be restored. But intrusion was only the beginning. In several documented cases from the Balkans and Aegean Islands, nuns were not killed during the initial assault. Instead, they were taken. Captivity was common in pre-modern warfare. Men, women, and children were seized and redistributed as slaves. For nuns, captivity carried a particular cruelty. They were valuable precisely because of their youth, their education, and their perceived purity. To their captors, these qualities translated into higher prices or personal use. For the nun, captivity meant erasure. Names were stripped away. Religious habits were torn off or burned. Some women were forced to dress as servants or concubines. Others were marched long distances, barefoot, through towns where they were mocked or displayed. Conversion to Islam, voluntary or coerced, was often presented as the only path to survival. Refusal could mean beatings, starvation, or sale into harsher conditions. Even when conversion occurred, it did not always end the suffering. A woman who converted lost her former identity entirely. She could never return to her convent. She could never rejoin her family. In the eyes of her former community, she was dead. In the eyes of her new masters, she was property. This is why some nuns, when faced with capture, chose death. Accounts from the 15th and 16th centuries describe sisters who leapt from cliffs, drowned themselves in wells, or begged their companions to kill them before soldiers arrived. These stories were preserved not as legends, but as warnings. They reveal how clearly these women understood the hierarchy of horrors before them. Death was finite. What awaited them in captivity had no clear end. In one well-documented episode during an Ottoman campaign in the Balkans, a convent was emptied over the course of a single night. The younger nuns were taken away at dawn. The older ones, deemed less useful, were left behind in the ruined building. By evening, those left alive attempted to resume prayer among broken icons and scattered bones. They had survived, but survival itself became a burden. Their community was gone. Their purpose had been shattered. Contemporary letters describe these survivors as walking graves, women who lived on without a life that made sense. Punishment did not always come through soldiers. At times, local officials enforced policies that crushed convents slowly. Heavy taxation, confiscation of land, and forced labor were used to make Christian institutions unsustainable. Nuns were compelled to work outside their cloisters, violating their vows under threat of violence. Some were assigned to serve Ottoman households as cooks or cleaners. They were not always beaten. They were simply reduced day by day to something other than what they had chosen to be. This slow destruction was often worse than sudden death. A nun's vow was not symbolic, it was total. To live while being unable to fulfill it was, in the religious worldview of the time, a kind of living damnation. Chroniclers repeatedly emphasized this point, not to exaggerate, but to explain the logic of despair. These women did not measure suffering the way modern audiences do. Physical pain mattered, but spiritual annihilation mattered more. Not all nuns resisted openly. Some endured quietly, hoping for release. Ransoms were sometimes paid. Occasionally, a woman was freed after years of captivity and returned to a Christian community. But return did not mean restoration. She carried stigma. She carried trauma that had no language. Many former nuns never took vows again. Some lived the rest of their lives in silence, dependent on charity, their former identities impossible to reclaim. It is important to say this clearly. These acts were not constant across the empire, nor were they officially celebrated. Many Ottoman officials punished soldiers who violated protected populations. Many Muslim communities sheltered Christian neighbors. History is not a single story, but in moments of chaos, the most vulnerable paid the highest price. For the nun, vulnerability was absolute. She had no husband to defend her, no sons to bargain for her release, no wealth to buy safety. Her power rested entirely on the hope that others would respect what she represented. When that respect vanished, nothing remained. Western observers who later encountered these stories often focused on the violence itself, but contemporaries understood something deeper. What made these acts worse than death was not only pain or humiliation, it was the intentional stripping away of meaning. To survive as someone else, under another name, serving another will, was to exist in a state the sisters themselves described as a living death. In some convents, this understanding shaped daily life. Nuns kept poison hidden. Others practiced rituals of collective resistance, agreeing in advance on how to respond if soldiers arrived. These were not acts of fanaticism. They were rational decisions made by women who understood the world they lived in. By the late Ottoman period, reforms reduced many of these abuses. Central authority tightened. International scrutiny increased, but memory lingered. In Christian communities across southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean, Stories of captured nuns were passed down quietly, generation after generation, not as propaganda, but as mourning. Today, these women are easy to overlook. They left few writings of their own. Most accounts come from priests, travelers, or later historians. Their voices reach us, filtered and fragmented, yet the pattern is clear enough to draw a sober conclusion. When power collapses into cruelty, the worst suffering is not always the quickest or the loudest. Sometimes it is the slow erasure of identity, the forced survival in a life that negates everything one once believed sacred. For the Christian nuns who faced these moments under Ottoman rule, death was feared, but there were fates they feared more, and in that fear we glimpse a harsh truth about history. Survival, when stripped of dignity, faith, and choice, can become its own form of punishment. The convent bell never rang again, but the silence it left behind still speaks. They had not slept. Sleep had become impossible once the rumors reached the valley. Villages burned to the south, refugees moving north with empty hands and hollow eyes. A merchant had whispered that the roads were filled with soldiers. Another said the churches were being stripped bare. No one spoke loudly. Loud voices invited attention, and attention was dangerous. Inside the stone walls of the convent, the sisters moved silently through prayer. Candles trembled in the cold air. The chapel smelled of wax and damp stone. These women had lived here most of their lives, enclosed from the world, protected by tradition, habit, and the unspoken belief that even in war, some places remained untouchable. They were wrong. This story is not a simple tale of cruelty or conquest. It is a record of how power, when combined with chaos, can turn faith into a liability and devotion into a sentence worse than death. It is about Christian nuns who lived under Ottoman rule during periods of conflict, and about what happened when their vows, their bodies, and their identities became tools of domination rather than objects of protection. To understand why their fate was described by contemporaries as worse than death, one must understand what it meant to be a nun in the pre-modern Christian world. A nun did not simply live apart from society. She erased her former self. Her family name was abandoned. Her hair was cut. Her future as a wife or mother was permanently surrendered. She belonged no longer to herself, but to God and to the rule of her convent. Her body was no longer considered her own. It was sacred, not in the sense of being powerful, but in the sense of being sealed. This sealing was everything. A convent was not merely a residence, it was a boundary. Once crossed by force, nothing inside could return to what it had been. For a nun, violation was not just physical harm, it was the collapse of the entire structure of meaning that defined her existence. In the territories conquered or governed by the Ottoman Empire, Christian institutions were legally permitted to exist. Churches functioned, monasteries endured, convents survived. In times of stability, many Christian communities lived in relative peace, but stability was fragile. War, rebellion, and frontier violence repeatedly shattered legal protections. When Ottoman armies moved, discipline varied. Central authority weakened the farther one traveled from the capital. Soldiers were often unpaid, rewarded instead with plunder. Local auxiliaries, mercenaries, and irregular forces followed the armies, accountable to no one. In these moments, law dissolved into opportunity. Convents were ideal targets. They were isolated, poorly defended, populated entirely with women. The nuns possessed no weapons, no fighting men, and little political value. What they had instead was symbolic significance. Their vulnerability made them visible. Their faith marked them as outsiders. Their chastity made them desirable commodities in a system where human beings could be bought, sold, and traded. When soldiers arrived at a convent, the first act was almost always forced entry. Doors were broken, gates torn open, locks smashed. Men entered spaces where no man had been in decades. This alone was considered a catastrophe. Chroniclers described nuns collapsing in terror at the sight of armed men in cloisters meant only for prayer. The sound of boots echoing through corridors, once reserved for whispered hymns, shattered the illusion that sacred boundaries still mattered. Then came the stripping. Religious habits were ripped away, veils torn from heads, crosses ripped from necks. This was not incidental, it was deliberate. To remove a nun's habit was to remove her identity. Nakedness or forced secular clothing symbolized her transformation from a sacred woman into an object. At this stage, death might still have seemed possible, but it often did not. Instead, selection occurred. Younger nuns were separated from older ones, the healthy from the sick, the beautiful from the plain. Some were immediately assaulted, others were bound and marched away. Those considered too old or too weak were sometimes left behind, not out of mercy, but because they had no economic value. For the young nuns who were taken, the next phase was captivity. Captivity was not temporary. It was not imprisonment with a known end. It was a state of unbeing. Women were herded with other captives, sometimes for weeks, marched across mountains and plains. They slept in the open. They were beaten for slowing down. Food was scarce, water scarcer. During these marches, some nuns died. Illness spread quickly. Others were killed for resisting or collapsing. Their deaths were rarely recorded. They vanished without ceremony, without burial, without names. Those who survived reached markets. Slave markets were regulated spaces within the Ottoman system. Human beings were inspected, priced, and sold. For nuns, this moment represented the final destruction of their former lives. They were no longer sisters. They were merchandise. Buyers examined their teeth, their skin, their posture. Their religious past mattered only insofar as it increased or decreased value. Nuns often possessed these skills. Once sold, a nun's fate diverged into several possible paths. None were good. Some were taken into households as servants. They cooked, cleaned, and waited on families who saw them not as humans, but as property. They could be beaten without consequence. They could be sold again. Their labor belonged entirely to their owner. Others were taken as concubines. For a woman who had vowed lifelong chastity, this fate was considered the ultimate horror. It was not only sexual violence, it was spiritual annihilation. Forced intimacy erased the possibility of returning to religious life. Even if freed, a former concubine could never resume her vows. In the eyes of her former faith community, she was permanently altered. Conversion was often imposed. Some captors offered a choice: convert to Islam and live, or resist and suffer. Conversion under duress was not spiritually valid in Christian theology, but theology offered little comfort in captivity. Many women converted simply to survive. Others refused and endured brutal punishment. But conversion did not restore agency. A converted woman was still enslaved. She was still owned. Her new faith granted no freedom. Instead, it severed her final connection to her former life. She could never return to her convent. She could never reclaim her name.
She existed in a liminal state, alive but erased. This was why death was sometimes chosen. There are documented cases of nuns who killed themselves to avoid capture. Others begged older sisters to suffocate them or cut their throats before soldiers arrived. These acts horrified later generations, but within their historical context, they were understood. Suicide was a sin, but so was living in forced apostasy and sexual enslavement. Faced with impossible choices, some chose the one that ended suffering quickly. Not all cruelty was sudden. In some regions, convents were not violently destroyed, but slowly dismantled. Ottoman authorities imposed taxes so heavy that communities could not survive. Land was confiscated, water access restricted. Nuns were forced to work outside their cloisters to meet demands, violating vows under threat of punishment.
Nuns became laborers. They carried stone, harvested crops, and served officials. Each task chipped away at their identity. They lived, but not as what they had chosen to be. Over years, convents emptied. Some women fled, others died. The institution itself dissolved, leaving behind women who no longer belonged anywhere. Survivors faced a future no less grim. A nun who escaped or was ransomed after years of captivity did not return to her former life. Trauma followed her. Her community viewed her with suspicion or pity. She might be welcomed, but she could not resume her vows. She existed as a reminder of vulnerability, a living testament to what could happen. Many lived the rest of their lives in silence. They depended on charity. They avoided public spaces. Some never spoke of what happened to them. Their suffering entered history indirectly through the writings of others. It is crucial to be precise here. These atrocities were not constant across the Ottoman world. They were not official policy. Many Ottoman officials punished abuses. Many Muslim neighbors protected Christian women. History is complex, but complexity does not erase patterns. In times of war and instability, Christian nuns occupied the lowest rung of protection. They were women. They were religious minorities. They were enclosed and defenseless. When violence erupted, they had no recourse. Their suffering followed predictable lines: violation, enslavement, erasure. What made their fate worse than death was not only pain, it was duration. Death ended suffering. Captivity extended it indefinitely. It forced women to live in conditions that contradicted everything they believed sacred. It demanded adaptation to a reality that negated their identity. This is why contemporary sources use language of annihilation rather than injury. The nuns were not merely harmed, they were unmade. Centuries later, these stories survive faintly, preserved in monastery records, letters, and oral tradition. They are rarely taught. They do not fit neatly into narratives of empire or tolerance. They exist in the margins, where the vulnerable lived and died. But they matter. They remind us that history's greatest cruelties are often quiet. They occur not only on battlefields, but in cloisters, bedrooms, kitchens, and markets. They target those least able to resist. When the convent bell fell silent, it was not just a building that was lost. It was a way of life, erased by force, remembered only through fragments. For the Christian nuns who lived through these moments, death was feared, but what awaited them beyond the convent walls was feared more. And in that fear, history leaves us a final, unsettling truth. Survival is not always mercy. Sometimes it is the longest punishment of all.